go in the order we did it, but I'll start with, actually, I'll start with skeletal system as a whole. There's just a few facts that I didn't say because I started with appendicular skeleton. So skeletal system is all the bones and all the joints of the body. That's unlikely to be a question, but all the bones and all the joints of the body is the skeletal system. And the 5 functions, just know this unlikely to be a question. Protection, the 5 functions of actually the skeletal system, or actually the 5 functions, yeah, you could say of skeletal system. Protection, support, supports the soft tissues, protects vital organs like the cranial bones and the rib cage protect heart and lungs, the cranial bones protect brain. So protection, facilitate movement. We think of muscles for movement, but the muscles pull on bones and change joint angles. So they facilitate movement. And then that funny word, or hemopoiesis, not funny, but it looks like homeostasis, but it's, be aware that these 2 words look alike. I will do homeostasis when we get to intro. I'll do that towards the end, but homeostasis, maintenance of body's internal environment with a narrow limb. I'm going to come back to that. But this word looks like it, hemopoiesis, is one of the 5 functions of skeletal system. It means all blood, red bone marrow is in the bones, organs, produces all types of blood cells. So production of, not just red blood cells, production of all types of blood cells. Production of all types of blood cells. Production of all types of blood cells is hemopoiesis. Okay, that's one of the 5, and the other is just storage of calcium and other minerals. Storehouse of calcium and other minerals. And then we already know this cold, but so axial skeleton is bones of head, neck, trunk, or division-wise, it's vertebral column, skull, rib cage. Either way is a good definition. Axial skeleton, bones of head, the neck, and the trunk, or the 3 divisions, the way we study it would be vertebral column, skull, and rib cage. Appendicular, all the bones of the 2 upper extremities and 2 lower extremities. Appendicular, all the bones of the 2 upper extremities and 2 lower extremities, including connecting bones. Clavicle, scapula, os coxa are appendicular. So clavicle, scapula, os coxa, appendicular. And then long bones by shape, all long bones, whether they're very large or tiny, all long bones have 2 epiphyses and a diaphysis. So all long bones, I didn't draw this so great, but all long bones have a proximal, and almost all the bones of the extremities are long bones, except for mainly you might have some irregular where they start, and you have short bones in the carpals and tarsals, but most of the bones of the extremities are long bones. And all long bones have a proximal epiphysis and a shaft and a distal epiphysis. Okay. So proximal epiphysis, shaft, distal epiphysis, and short bones only, they're kind of cube shaped, although it might not look that way, but only carpals, tarsals, nothing else, short bones. All carpals in the wrist, all tarsals in the ankle are short bones, but nothing else is short bone by development and basically shape and development. So the only short bones are carpals, tarsals. Now flat bones bones have a flattened type shape. Now the only ones you need to know test-wise that are flat, one sternum, all the ribs, parietals. That usually doesn't come up because skull bones, some of them are controversial whether they're irregular or flat. So we're not going to ask that. So most of the skulls are irregular. Parietals, everyone agrees, are flat. Others are hard to get unanimous opinion. So the ones that are, and flat bones are for protection. Long bones are for big movement. short bones are for agility at wrist and ankle, but we don't ask that. And flat bones mainly protect sternum, ribs, protect heart, lungs. Sternum and ribs are the famous flat bones. Sternum and ribs are the main flat bones. Parietals are also protection, kind of flat. And if it's not long, short, or flat and has an irregular shape, we call it irregular. There's some controversy, not going to be on the test. We don't usually ask that, but most of skull, entire vertebral column, and os coxa are, everyone agrees os coxa are irregular. Most of the skull's irregular. We're not going to be specific. The entire vertebral column and the os coxa are definitely irregular. And what are the only sesamoid bones that you need to know, sesamoid by names? The patellas. There might be some others, but the only ones that in the 206 that you need to know are patellas. And so I'll do vertebral column. I have time for vertebral column, and then we'll take a break. I'll just do, so skull and rib cage won't take too long, and then we can do joints and the other, I won't say odds and ends, but when we come back, after I finish axial, I'll do joint movement, and then intro, and mainly tissues. Cells and chemistry, I'm only going to spend a couple of minutes because there's only one question each. So we're going to finish by 5. We will finish, but I'm not going to rush through this. So vertebral column is, now there's a lot of functional stuff, but it's hard to put that in a question. I'll answer questions after I finish this. So basically 26 bones make up vertebral column. 26 irregular bones, and just know regionally 7 cervical, C1 through C7. 7 cervical and 12 thoracic, T1 through T12, 12 thoracic, T1 through T12, 5 lumbar, L1 through L5, then that's 24, 1 sacrum, fused bone, 1 coccyx, also a fused bone. So 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 1 sacrum, 1 coccyx. And of the big 3, since the sacral region, which includes sacrum and coccyx, doesn't move that much, when we say what's the most movable, it's between cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. So which region is the most movable? Cervical. That's a standard question. Which region is the most movable? Cervical. And if they same 3 choices, which region is the least movable of the big 3? Yeah, everyone agrees thoracic. Even though you might think lumbar, because many adults have lower back stiffness, but in the idealized or so-called healthy state, lumbar mobility, because you don't have the restriction of the armor ribs, it's been measured that the lumbar region movement is greater than thoracic. Thoracic is the least movable of the big 3 regions. And just know curves, the primary curve present at birth, the remnants in our body is, I'm not going to draw pictures, I'll just say thoracic and sacral are remnants of, they never change, so they're primary. The original convex posteriorly shape, the thoracic is never changed from that. So it's primary, and the sacrum and coccyx curve, sacral curve and thoracic curve, even in our adult body, is primary, but the cervical curve concave, it went the other way early on after birth. So the cervical and lumbar are secondary. Just know the 2 secondary curves, that means develops after birth. The 2 secondary curves are cervical and lumbar, meaning develops after birth. And which of the 4 curves is the last to develop chronologically? Lumbar, even though cervical and lumbar are both secondary, lumbar develops as toddler stage, 6 months to a year after birth. Cervical usually 2 to 3 months. We're not going to ask time period, but cervical, lumbar, both secondary. Lumbar comes after cervical in development. And then features of a typical vertebra. So the features of a typical vertebra, just know we don't really ask too much on this, to be honest, even though it's important. And if they say, what's the most weight-bearing anterior portion? What's this called?
The body.
Body. What's the most posterior and palpable feature? Good, spinous process. Now, these are a little shorter, but what's the most lateral? Transverse processes. Okay. And then what's the giant foramen in a vertebra called? In each vertebra, the giant foramen sort of in the center is the vertebral foramen. Now, there's always a question, which of these transmits the spinal cord? A, vertebral foramen, B, intervertebral foramen, C, transverse foramen, D, none of them. Which transmits the, yeah. The distinction between vertebral foramen, and it's easy to make a reading mistake, but just know, there's always one or the other question. If they say the vertebral foramen or the spinal cord is transmitted by which foramen transmits the spinal cord is usually what they say. It's always between the vertebral and the intervertebral foramina. But the vertebral foramen of any vertebra, the spinal cord goes through. So the vertebral foramen transmits the spinal cord. But if they say which foramina or foramen transmits spinal nerves, it's the intervertebral. That you need two vertebrae side by side. It's formed by two adjacent vertebrae all the way up, down. But just know this: vertebral foramen transmits, of singular or plural, doesn't matter. Vertebral foramen transmits spinal cord. Intervertebral foramina transmits spinal nerves. There's always going to be one or the other. Vertebral foramen transmits spinal cord. Intervertebral foramina transmits spinal nerves. Okay, and then you also have two superior articular processes. On every vertebra, you have two superior articular processes. Articulate, the name's great, tells you articulate with vertebra above. Superior articular processes articulate with vertebra above. And harder to see, but it's not going to be, not an issue. You just need to know the name. Superior articular vertebra, inferior articular processes. So the superior articular processes articulate with the vertebra above, and the inferior articular processes articulate with the vertebra below. So superior articular processes are vertebra above, inferior articular processes articulate with vertebra below, and then just know the neural arch of a vertebra does not include the body. It's unlikely they would ask you, but once in a while I've seen it. Neural arch definition: two pedicles, the little feet, and then two lamina of a vertebra. Two pedicles and two lamina of any vertebra. Hard to see them, but two pedicles and two lamina equals neural arch. Just the formula name: two pedicles and two lamina equal neural arch.
Neural arch?
Oh, yeah, actually I'll write that. Okay, so did everybody have this, or it's two pedicles equals two pedicles and two lamina? We know it's one vertebra. Equals two pedicles and two lamina. And then the more likely question: what's the total number of processes on a typical vertebra? What's the total number of processes? Well, don't shut up. Let me finish. Okay. What's the total number of processes on a typical vertebra? A4, C6, D7, E9. What's the total? Has to be named process. Body wouldn't count. It's got to be called either spinous process, transverse process, superior articular, or inferior. I just gave you. So what's the total number if you add that up? 7. Yeah, that's because the things named process, 3 of them are paired. 2 transverse processes, paired. 2 superior articular, 4. That's paired. 2 inferior makes 6, and the singular spinous process makes 7. So there are 7 processes named total number of processes is, on a typical vertebrate, is 7. And let me think, I'll just say regionally, that's all the general questions for typical vertebra. See, the cervical region have 2 extra features.